Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on this wonderful afternoon here in Miami. We are live streaming on the internet. For those of you who are watching on the internet, don't forget you can always call the store and get a book ordered from us. We can have the author sign it for you, or you can even ask a question of the author while we are live streaming, and he will answer it for you online. And while we do like to have you here in the store, you can always watch online wherever you are, all around the country and all around the world. I would like to very quickly say hello to the owner of Books and Books, Mitchell Kaplan, who is probably watching us from Australia right now, where he is on vacation. So hello, Mitchell. And I know that you are 14 hours ahead of us, so if you could please call me if the heat wins so I can get a bet down beforehand. I would appreciate that. Thank you. And also, while you are silencing your cell phones, if you could please take a look at our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a rundown of all the great events we have at Books and Books every night of the week, every day of the week, every day of the year. A couple of note worth mentioning. We've got former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Timothy Geithner will be joining us next week at the Downtown College of Miami-Dade. Emily and Mika Brzezinski will be joining us. Any number of wonderful events. As I say, you can pick this up when you're buying your copy of Mount Terminus this evening, or you can go to our website at booksandbooks.com and give us your email address so you don't miss a thing. But tonight, as I say, we are very happy to have with us David Grand and his new book, Mount Terminus. But here to give the formal introduction of David is his friend and colleague. Please welcome Jesse Alfieri.
Hello. I'm very happy to be able to introduce David Grand, who was my thesis mentor at Fairleigh Dickinson University and who has become a good friend. I remember when I first met David in the winter of 2009, he was finishing the novel that ended up taking him over 10 years to write. That novel was Mount Terminus. Since its publication by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in March, Carolyn Kellogg of the Los Angeles Times has called it a serious work of art. The Washington Post's Ron Charles has written that it is endlessly inventive, and the New York Times Book Review has picked it as an editor's choice. Grand is also the author of Laos, a New York Times notable book and a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year, and The Disappearing Body, which Book Forum described as satirical noir at its mesmerizing best. His writing has appeared in anthologies, as well as the New York Times Magazine, Travel and Leisure, Black Book, and elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming David Grand.
All right, I guess I won't be needing that. Thank you, Jesse, for that introduction, and thank you to Books and Books for having me here, and thank you all for coming out on a Saturday late afternoon. I'm going to read a passage from the beginning of the novel, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book. No one knew where the spring on Mount Terminus originated. They could only conjecture from the warmth of its waters that the aquifer lay deep underground, near the hearth of the earth. Jacob sounded out for Bloom the hiss and groan he would hear when the vapors rose and expanded into the pipes of their new home. He spoke of flowering gardens and bulky vegetable patches, the scents of citrus groves and the perfume of trees canopied in mentholated leaves, of a narrow promontory pointing like a finger over an ancient seabed to a distant shore. And he said to his son, "Please, my dear, tell me you want to see it." Bloom wanted to say, "No, I don't want to see it. I want to go home." But he said instead, "Yes, of course, Father. I want to see it all." For this kindness, Jacob thanked his son, and thanked him again. He bent over and squeezed Bloom tight, pressed his cheek against the stiff collar of his shirt, and for several moments too long held him there. Father and son dwelled in the comfort of prolonged silences thereafter. They listened to the clatter of rails beat the rhythm of their progress across the prairies. On the Sabbath, Jacob covered his head and adorned his shoulders in a prayer shawl. He kindled the light, blessed the wine, the bread. The young Bloom tried to invent an image of the place his father had described, but his thoughts returned to the familiar landscape, to the familiar surface of Woodhaven's lake, mirroring the rise of its valley and its sky, and he recalled memories of his mother standing in profile before a succession of windows. In the expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert, he awoke from a dream in which he saw just such an ephemeral image, and he called out to his mother, at which time Jacob gently reminded him she was no longer with them. While passing the painted archways of the Sonoran Desert, Bloom wondered aloud how it was possible she could have died so young. And the elder Rosenblum, who appeared at a loss to answer Bloom, drew for his son an illustration of a heart in its anatomical intricacy, and pointed to its various chambers to better show him how the muscle in his mother's chest had ceased to function. Neither his father's scientific reason nor the warm touch of his hand would come to fill the desert air with moisture. It wouldn't soften the stark light of its sun. It wouldn't curtail the boy's expectations of seeing his mother's silhouette materialize in the shadows of their birth. The train thundered through tunnels and canyon passes, whispered along the outer edges of mountains. When they turned southwest from Mojave into the Sierra, they joined the path of a river Bloom mistook for a stream. The thin, lazy current delivered them from the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains onto the Great Basin. Here, the air of their compartment warmed with the scent of orange blossoms and the stench of industry. Opposite the river, foundry stacks disgorged black smoke, wisps of which swept northward on a pulsating breeze over the flat tops of brick buildings whose uneven lines foregrounded the range. The mountains, the city, their combined measure, the immensity of their weight, the boy felt in his chest. And more so than before, he wanted to retrace the rail lines east, so he might once again feel the balance of Woodhaven's valley, watch the August rains thrash its lake, meander the damp trails of its hills. But they had come this far, and Bloom knew his father wouldn't be persuaded to turn back. For reasons the boy couldn't understand, Jacob was determined to reside here, as if he had been commanded to do so by God. Go forth to the desolate end of the world. There, said his father, when the train began to slow, there ahead is our new beginning. So the novel is set in Los Angeles at the turn of the last century. It starts around 1900, maybe a little bit before. Time is somewhat ambiguous throughout the story. And it's a coming-of-age story about this boy, Bloom, whose life we track over the course of almost 20 years. And it's also the coming-of-age story about the motion picture industry and the city of Los Angeles itself. Those histories, they coincided with one another. I was particularly interested in a few facts I read when I first started researching this novel. With the fact that when Thomas Edison was inventing the kinetoscope and all of the technology that went into early projection devices, when filmmakers kind of cottoned on to this and projectors and motion picture cameras became more than just toys and went into proper use. Edison sent lawyers after them, and they took off from places like New Jersey and New York, and they went on the road. They became itinerant filmmakers to avoid his lawyers, so they wouldn't have to, pay the royalties to Edison. And they would chase the sun. They would, come down here, come down to the south. They would go across the country, and eventually they ended up in Los Angeles. And if you've ever been to Los Angeles, you know how brilliant the light is there and how consistent the light is. One of the characters in the story is named Simon. He is Bloom's half-brother, who he's united with for the first time about 75 pages into the novel. And in many ways, the novel, it's mostly written from Bloom's perspective, from the perspective of an artist. But Simon is a significant figure. He's one part William Mulholland and one part maybe Samuel Goldwyn or one of these big movie moguls. He is one of these itinerant filmmakers and producers who goes out west and has a vision of transforming the landscape. And I mentioned William Mulholland, who was the man who brought water to Los Angeles in 1914. He built the aqueduct that ran from the Owens River Valley and made it the city that it is now. So I was really fascinated with this period of time because there's this huge population boom in the teens, and as you can tell, this character Bloom is very quiet, and I deliver him to Mount Terminus, this isolated place. Well, he's on top of a mountain with his grieving father. He's lost his mother. And the two of them live there with a cook and maid. They have a large library. Jacob, the father, is an inventor who invented a small part in the novel. It's called the Rosenblum Drive and Loop. In reality, it's something called a Geneva Drive. And it's this small timing mechanism that was bewildering Thomas Edison and W.K.L. Dixon, who was one of Edison's big inventors. They were having a difficult time making the celluloid run through the kinetoscope and through the cameras without catching fire. And also, they were having a difficult time creating the right kind of stop motion you need in order to perceive film in the way that we perceive film, mostly as reality. You know, when you look at those old silent pictures, you see them flickering. And you know, that's because the technology hadn't been nuanced, perfected just yet. Jacob makes some money. He purchases quite a bit of land in Southern California, and Simon arrives. He has this big vision, and then the story kind of takes off from there. But most of that story is told on the periphery. The central focus of the novel is it's really about artistic expression and the imagination. And Bloom is an artist. He grows up. You see him growing up in the novel to become quite accomplished, and he apprentices himself to a number of filmmakers on Simon's studio lot. That's how Simon makes his living. He opens up a studio not too far from this mountaintop estate, and there Bloom meets this film director, Gottlieb, who he's admired for many years. And this section is Gottlieb giving Bloom his first assignment. "If you're hesitant to make a commitment," said Gottlieb, "if you're unwilling to sacrifice what I think necessary." "No," said Bloom, "I'll do as you ask." "Not even Simon will drag you down there, understood? If he asks what's become of you, what do you tell him?" "I belong to you." "Precisely. Then we're agreed?" "Yes," said Bloom, "we're agreed." And with that said, Gottlieb made his exit. 3 weeks from today, Rosenblum. 3 weeks from today, Mr. Gottlieb. Once Bloom heard the front door slammed shut, he walked over to the desk, on which Gottlieb had scribbled his hand. On the blotter, Bloom read the title, Mephisto's Affinity. Following this was a short description of a domestic scene in which Mephistopheles' wife grants her husband leave to visit Earth for a long-needed holiday. "He rises up from the underworld and enters the world of the living," wrote Gottlieb. "He witnesses the sins of sinners, sees the avaricious, the gluttonous, the envious, etc., all in need of his services. But because he is on leave, he resists temptation and turns away from their folly. He is resigned to do as his wife said he should. He is resigned to enjoy a devil's Sabbath. Today he will write no contracts and make no bargains. Today he will capture no souls. In which case, where, Mr. Rosenblum, will Mephistopheles find his joy? How will he experience abandon? In whom will he find his affinity? For hours after Gottlieb had left him alone, Bloom paced the floor of the library, waiting for the first image to come to him. He paced through the remainder of the day and into the night. He lay awake in his bed, hoping something in the shadows of his room might take hold. The following morning, for the first time in a long time, Gus didn't wake him to go to work. Bloom climbed the stairs of the tower and through his telescope searched the basin, thinking perhaps there he should see something, anything that would stir him. But he found only an image of a landscape ravaged by his brother's endeavors. Across the vast stretch of the ancient seabed, a number of citrus groves had been raised, their fields left barren. The disheartening image advanced an even duller emptiness than he'd felt before he climbed to the tower's pavilion. His mind void, his spirit enervated, he searched for Roya, from whom, without intending to, he'd grown apart in the 3 years he'd spent on the studio lot. For 3 days, Bloom searched for her, and for 3 days she managed to elude him. He wrote notes to her and left them about the house, in his room, in the gallery, in the parlor, all of them saying the same thing: "My dear Roya, please come back to me. I am waiting for you at the pool." And for 3 days he waited at the pool's edge, much of the time spent looking at the still waters in search of a way into Gottlieb's scenario. But still nothing came. On the 3rd day, he reclined on the pool's ledge and fell asleep, and when he awoke to a tickling sensation on the tip of his nose, he saw falling over his face the canopy of Roya's hair, backlit by the noontime sun. She sat beside him, lifted his head onto her lap, and when Bloom asked for her forgiveness, she stroked away the hair hanging in his eyes, bent down, and kissed him on the mouth. By the way, Roya is the maid. And with the sensation of that kiss, he recalled what had been lost to him in the years he'd spent away from the quiet rhythm of the estate. In the toil of work, in the tedium of labor, he had forgotten the profound pleasure he had once taken in Roya's quiet company. He forgot how uninhibited and free his imagination was with her at his side. As he did when he was a child, he spent the afternoon trailing after his silent companion through the rooms of the villa, sat with her over lunch in the parlor, and in the late afternoon he meandered with her through the mazes of the front gardens. And there he shared with her the scenario Gottlieb had written for him, and there she showed him what he had been waiting to see. She climbed atop an empty pedestal on which a long-lost statue had once resided, and she playfully struck a pose for Bloom, and then another, at which point Bloom began to envision in the darkness of his mind all the images that had refused to show themselves to him when he was alone in his solitude. He took Roya by the waist and gently lowered her to the ground. "Thank you," he said, "thank you." And he took hold of her hand, kissed it several times, and walked with her to the courtyard, to his studio, where for the next several weeks she would keep him company in the evenings, late into the night, and there he would remain, shut away. With Roya's help, he conceived Mephisto's underworld as a hell bathed in white light, white walls, a world in which the food and decor, the complexions and garments were white on white on white. So absent contrast, when the audience looked on, they would find themselves craving, not unlike Mephistopheles, the smallest divergence. He drew Mephisto dressed in Simon style, white suit and shoes, white vest and tie. He would stare down a never-ending white corridor, declaring, "Eternity! How tiresome! How tiresome!" He would declare to the unchanging white horizon, out a white window frame. "How tiresome," he would declare to the face of a white clock, whose white hands he would spend his time starting and stopping at will. At which point his wife would declare, "How tiresome you can be." Sweeping white dust from a white broom in his direction, she would proclaim him an idle layabout. "Go," she would order, sweeping him off. "Be gone. I can't stand the sight of you. Take a holiday." Mephisto would brighten momentarily at the very thought. He would pack a small case and kiss his wife goodbye. "One rotation of the earth," she would say, "and not one revolution more." Mephisto, in that instant, would raise his arm and rise into a billowing white sheet, out of which he would emerge through a crevice in the earth, shaded in blacks and grays. In the world of the living, his white suit would turn charcoal, as would the lines about his eyes and the hair of his mustache and goatee. He would pass a picnic blanket on which a man as large as a sedan would be parked before a cornucopia of meats and fruits, cakes, pitchers of ale. Bloom drew an image of a man reclining on his enormous side, pointing a thick pickle at a cadaverous manservant. More, the man would order. The gargantua would rip away chicken legs with his hands, crunch with his teeth into the heads of squabs, take voluminous bites out of legs of lamb from frosted cakes and crusty pies. Mephisto, as he witnessed the cheeks swell larger and larger, would be tempted to approach the glutton, but would restrain himself and proceed forward to a circle of men throwing dice. There he would watch as more and more money piled onto the ground, and he would witness a man shed from his finger his wedding band and from his wrist his watch, and he would observe him go so far as to extract a gleaming crown from a tooth. For a second time, Mephisto would refrain from conducting business and move on to find himself in a meadow, where he would be drawn to a fountain at whose top would stand a statue of a naked nymph. He would walk over the water, collecting in the catch basin, and run his hand over the pedestal, and with a wave of his finger he would bring the marble to life, and with another wave turn the living stone to flesh. Together he and his naked creature would set out arm in arm into a garden maze where they would animate a general and his horse, an ancient god and goddess, a storybook maiden and storybook villain. He and his companion would shepherd them to a meadow where for a full day and night they would dance and dine under the sun and the moon. Bloom conjured a stage on which each figure would perform a short pantomime, an allegory in which they would enact the plight of the 7 deadly sins. And when the day would begin again and then wane into a second sunset, Mephisto's wife would appear in an agitated state. She would be so aggravated by her husband's antics, she would freeze the statues in mid-reverie, and Mephisto along with them. With a flicker of her finger, she would open a crevice in the earth, take her beloved by his marbled nose, and drag him down into a pit of white light. So that's the first film that Bloom makes, with the help of Gottlieb. And I just was going to give you a couple of more glimpses into Bloom's life. As I mentioned, Jacob was an inventor. He was also a collector of optical devices. Another thing that I found in my research was I did a lot of reading into pre-cinematic history, and it kind of brought me back to Plato's allegory of the cave and to Indonesian shadow puppets, and then magic lanterns and magic lantern shows, which began in the 18th century. This man named Etienne Gaspard, he made these magic lantern shows into something of a spectacle. He would fill a cathedral with multiple lanterns and projectionists. There would be minstrels playing music, a narrator telling the stories of oftentimes mythological characters, and they were known as phantasmagory performances, and they also tended to go to the dark side. I think Mephisto's Affinity is kind of a comical version of one of these old phantasmagory shows. Well, in any case, Bloom has proposed a new film to Gottlieb, which required in Gottlieb's mind for Bloom to have a greater understanding of love. Bloom goes through through courtship, and he's a miserable failure. He can't find a woman who sparks his interest, who he feels connected to. And just by happenstance, Gottlieb sends for this friend of his, Dr. Straight, who's an experimental psychologist. And he turns up one day with Isabella, who is his ward. Trying to think if there's anything else you need to know. They've come to study Jacob's collection of optical devices. Maybe one day, Joseph, you'll recall the experience Isabella and I are about to give you and apply it to one of your pictures. Maybe one day in the future you'll recall what it is I'm about to say to you now, which is this: out of the depths of the mind, new powers are always emerging. And with that said, Dr. Straight and Isabella strapped onto Bloom a shoulder harness, which was attached to a device Isabella had invented and named the invertoscope. An elegant contraption consisting of a series of angled mirrors that rose up in a shaft whose design resembled a periscope's. At its highest point, its neck bent forward and then down. It could be manipulated with a system of pulleys whose cords dangled from rings just above his ears. If he pulled on the cord above his right ear, he could elevate the scope's angle upward and turn it a full 180 degrees around to his back. If he pulled on the cord above his left ear, he could rotate his perception back around and downward. I just got this idea when I was, flying down here, when they do the... The scope, therefore, provided Bloom a field of vision extending from the front of his body to the sky to his back. When the invertoscope had been fully secured to his head, he could now fully appreciate Dr. Straight's short speech in the courtyard, as he clearly understood, quite literally, the doctor's notion of heightened consciousness. He felt himself made strangely tall and elongated and detached. It was as if he'd stepped out of his skin altogether, released, as Dr. Straight said, from his containment, to become an invisible interloper looking down on his own life. It took the better part of the day to learn how to maneuver with the invertoscope towering over him. But the material Isabella had used to manufacture the device and the shoulder harness she'd designed were remarkably well engineered. So well, in fact, that before the morning had finished, Bloom had grown accustomed to its weight and was able to adjust his balance and gait. As a precaution, however, Isabella remained at his side, her arm entwined in his, advising him along the way when to make small adjustments to the scope with the pulleys. They spent the day walking the grounds, first through the mazes of the front gardens, next through the open field to the promontory, where Isabella held him with her chest pressed against his back, her hands gripping his shoulders, as Bloom stood at the headland's edge. There he looked down and saw himself looking down, and he described to Isabella the state in which he discovered his father at the bottom of the ravine. She guided him through the grove, around low-lying limbs, walked him under the canopy of trees jeweled in ripe summer fruit, and there in the shade he looked down on himself and Isabella as a bird might. And here, when Bloom had begun to question his ability to love, he found this was the perspective he needed. He reached out with the hand nearest Isabella's shoulder and said to her, "This space between us, this narrow space separating our shoulders, reminds me of a passage I read in Leonardo's notebooks. He advised painters who lacked inspiration to contemplate with a reflective eye a crack in an old wall, and there the painter would find what was lacking." When Bloom said this, he could see from his vantage point Isabella look at his hand and tenderly take hold of it. She then leaned into him to close the gap between them. They next walked with great care up the stairwell to the tower's pavilion, where Bloom introduced her to his birds and demonstrated the various lines of repartee he had developed with Elijah, that's his cockatiel. Here he could see the muscles in Isabella's face relax in appreciation of his aviary, and later, when he observed with what ease she adjusted the gauges of the telescope to suit her eye, he couldn't help but think how naturally she fit into his private world above the tree line. So that's just Bloom falling in love with Isabella, and they have a relationship that is intense and short, and he's hooked. And in the strange world of mine, Isabella and Dr. Straight, they, some months later after Bloom and Isabella meet for the first time, they are invited to visit the field hospitals in France. We're kind of, we're many years into the novel, and the First World War is going on. They've been invited by another experimental psychologist to conduct invertoscope experiments on the critically wounded, on the shell-shocked. And Bloom is heartbroken. He spends most of his time on Mount Terminus. He rarely leaves, and Isabella's courage inspires him to take a journey of his own. And he's journeying now through the construction zone, Simon's construction zone. The aqueduct is near complete, and Simon is developing the land below Mount Terminus, and this greatly disturbs Bloom. In fact, I'm just going to read a very, very short passage to give you an idea of that. From atop his tower, Bloom witnessed in the months ahead the basin teem with men in the thousands. They dug and poured foundations into the shape of a grid, and across the grid they dug trenches into which they laid pipe. And alongside the trenches they dug holes in which they erected power and telephone poles. And to complete the reticulation, they began running parallel to the trenches and the high-tension wires, a system of interconnected roadways. Every now and then Simon met him at the edge of the promontory, where they stood together in an awkward silence, and they looked across the panorama, and his brother appeared to Bloom to be growing brighter with light, stronger and more powerful, larger than life. On these occasions, Bloom wondered if what he witnessed was evidence of Simon's better nature shining forth, or was it the Dybbuk strengthening his pride? The dust generated from below swelled into the air. It blocked Bloom's view of the sea, ballooned into a red and orange holocaust. For months on end, the vista that had brought his mother and father to Mount Terminus, the vista to which his father longed to return, the vista onto which Bloom first looked when he arrived here, was no more. And every day now he felt as if a small part of him was dying. And when the news arrived about Isabella, he couldn't help but perceive the horrible image spread across the landscape of the shore as a harbinger. All right, and this will be the final passage that I read. And once again, I thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions when I'm through, please feel free to ask. When Bloom drove through the gates and moved beyond them, he began to enjoy the sensation of being alone and in motion. For the first time since reading Isabella's letter, he felt alive in his solitude, and the more alive he felt, the faster he took the turns on the mountain road. He raced his way into the canyon, and when he reached the bottom, he accelerated into the eyesore of the construction zone, appreciating for the first time in what ways forward motion was a form of escape. And he wondered why it hadn't occurred to him sooner that the landscapes portrayed to him in his reading of others' solitary travels wouldn't echo through his own experience of motion. As he hurtled past one foundation after the next, he became a simplification of himself, a small quantity of immaterial parts whose image, if he were to paint it, would consist of the impressionistic streaks of his mother's brush. To prolong his ascension of spirit, Bloom considered if perhaps he should remain in motion indefinitely, if he shouldn't turn up the coastal road and continue driving north, at the very least until he tired of the thrill. But when he reached the shore and saw across the channel the mountain peaks of Santa Ynez Island, he saw in the island's barely visible contours the mirror image of Mount Terminus. And without wanting it to happen, the euphoria he felt only a moment earlier reversed to melancholy. And while Bloom urged himself to ignore this reversal, it appeared as if his body and not his mind were in control of his actions, as he slowed to a halt and sat and stared, thinking of Isabella. He spent what remained of the morning doing what he might have done had he never left his tower's pavilion. He sat and watched. From the seat of his car he observed vessels small and large moor and unmoor, moor at and unmoor from the docks. They arrived and departed at a leisurely pace, a pace that intimately appealed to Bloom's sense of time. The more he saw of their comings and goings, the more he felt compelled to unmoor himself from his seat and take a stroll. He carried with him a tablet and a fistful of charcoals, and with the same impetus he felt to explore the docks, he felt a need to stop and sketch the watermarks and rust patterns he discovered on the nearby hulls of ships. Over and over again he found himself rubbing into the paper the same shape, the very same blemish as the mark on Isabella's letter. When a group of merchant mariners saw him, they gathered around to watch, and seeing how skilled Bloom was, they asked if he would sketch them. Bloom spent the remainder of the afternoon deciphering the lines and forms of these men's figures, hoping in the process to divine some inspiration that would set him on his way in one direction or another. And after some time of standing face to face with these men, he confided he was aimless and looking for a destination. They were bound for the vanilla plantations of Madagascar. That, Bloom said, was perhaps a little too far. The largest, most doltish of the men screwed up his muscular face and said, "Leave it to me." At the insistence of this man, who reminded Bloom of Gus, he took several puffs from a pipe containing in its bowl a black, tacky substance, which when lit smelled edible, sweet. And as soon as Bloom inhaled the rich smoke into his lungs, his head tingled, then turned pleasantly numb, and soon thereafter his limbs grew weary and his mind began to pattern the world into sequences of incongruous images and sounds. The seamen sat before him, their faces indifferent and still. They each pointed at him, but their eyes stared into the sun. Although their lips were shut tight, Bloom heard originating from inside their chests hearty guffaws of laughter. Each of them, one in succession of the other, then shut his eyes. And as each set of eyes closed, the sound of the laughter, as thunder from a lightning storm sounds as it passes into the distance, quieted into whispers. And then there was silence, then darkness, then a dream, in which Bloom was levitating over the surface of the ocean. Bloom woke up to the sway of water beneath him and felt running through his body the vibration of an accelerating motor. He recognized the sensation of being in motion, and when his vision cleared, he found himself in his car. It was parked on the deck of a ferry, and gathered around his windows was a menagerie of children costumed as swabbies, the group of them volubly discussing their disappointment with the fact that Bloom wasn't dead. He opened the car door and stepped onto the deck, where he saw the port behind them had flattened into 2 dimensions. The definition of the coastline grew soft, and with the basin and the distant mountain range spreading out before him as would an eroding sandcastle, he had a difficult time locating Mount Terminus. Watching the coastline slip farther and farther away, Bloom turned to the nearest ferryman, a man with a topographical map of acne scars, and asked him when the next ferry would run back to the port. "But this is the last ferry of the day," he told Bloom. "All of us," he said, turning his head to Santa Ynez, "we now all go home." The soonest Bloom could return would be first thing in the morning. Upon hearing this news, he must have looked like a lost little boy, because at that moment this unfortunate-looking man, who the others unkindly called Guapo, smiled sympathetically and patted Bloom on the back. He introduced himself as Eduardo and told Bloom not to worry, that there were very nice accommodations on the island. Because Bloom liked the way Eduardo spoke and thought his eyes understanding, he said to him, "Have you ever met a grown man who has never spent a night away from home?" Eduardo shook his head. I'm not sure why I'm telling you this, said Bloom, but I'll miss waking up to my birds in the morning. When Bloom mentioned his birds, Eduardo's entire presence brightened, and then he asked if, like him, Bloom had a great love of birds. Bloom told him he loved his birds very much. Then come, he said, I'll show you a trick I don't show to many people. Eduardo led Bloom to the ferry's stern, where from a compartment he pulled out a metal tub filled with minnows. He rolled up the sleeve on his right arm and in one deft motion sunk his hand into the water and pulled out a sparkling fish. He held on to it by the tail and asked Bloom, "You're not very delicate, are you?" Bloom wasn't certain he understood what Eduardo meant, but he shook his head no. Eduardo in turn lifted his other hand to the struggling fish, placed his thumb and forefinger over its bulbous eyes and squeezed until the fish stilled. He wiped the pink ooze that had gushed onto his fingers on the legs of his yellow uniform, and now, with a hearty smile that revealed a mouthful of chipped teeth, he pointed the fish up to a flock of gulls trailing in the sky at the back of the boat. "Pick one," he said to Bloom. "What for?" "You pick one, anyone. I'll make it come for a visit." Bloom now must have looked at him with disbelief because Eduardo said, "You like birds, yes?" "Yes," said Bloom. "You're not afraid of birds, no?" "No." "Then pick one. I'll make it come for a visit." To make it easy for him to know which of the birds, Bloom pointed into the shadowy underbelly of the anarchic flock and said, "That one, the one farthest to the right." "No problem." And then Eduardo, most certainly the ugliest man on all the seas, showed Bloom the most beautiful display of man controlling the natural world he would ever see. With the panache of a magician who worked at sleight of hand, this unassuming ferryman striped his palm with the silver minnow, and using its glimmering surface reflected the sun into the eye of the very gull Bloom had pointed to. By casting the light just so, he lured the bird away from the flock to the rail of the ship, where as if it were hung on an invisible string, it gracefully hovered with its wings outstretched on the headwind. Bloom laughed with delight. He could feel his smile fill his face. And Eduardo, seeing him smile for the first time, again shared with Bloom his broken teeth. "Now you know why it is we call him Guapo," Bloom heard from over his shoulder. When he turned, he found one of the other ferrymen, a fat pink man with a strawberry nose, who added, "The birds, they find Guapo irresistible." Bloom turned back to Eduardo then, when at just the right angle for the gull to catch the fish in its crooked beak, he lobbed the minnow into the air. The bird snatched it up, and with Eduardo's spell now broken, it lifted away beyond the flock and flew into the blinding glow of the sun. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Any questions? You don't have to have questions, but if you do, go. Yes, Jesse.
So, how long do you think the next book is going to take?
I'm just going to say I hope it doesn't take as long as this one to write. This book was a big departure for me. My first two novels were kind of dark comedies, and this was this is a lyrical novel. There is a density of imagery here that required me to write 3 or 4 pages at a time and then compress it down into 3 or 4 sentences, and this was kind of a daily routine for, I don't know, almost 10 years. So I was determined to write this book. I always wanted to write a book set in Los Angeles. It's where I grew up. And I found that I couldn't quite get my head around the city as it exists now. And so I needed to kind of peel back these layers of history in order to, to deal with the story I wanted to tell. And it all kind of began with this, with the state of mind one finds him or herself in a city like Los Angeles. This blissful state of alienation that I think you experience on any given day, because you're dealing with such an enormous landmass not unlike here in southern Florida, you're always in your car, traveling from place to place, and human contact tends to be limited. And so that was sort of the raw emotion that I began with, and then in order to kind of create an environment for that feeling, I had to go back in time and create these pristine landscapes and a great deal of silence. And in order to do that in prose, you need to rely on a density of imagery and imagination, and it just took me a really long time to craft Bloom's perspective. Any other questions? Yes.
In the New York Times, like the write-up by Owen King, he mentioned possible movie. What is what's your opinion of taking your writing?
I think it would be an impossible movie to make. Maybe not impossible. I don't know. I try not to think about those kinds of things because I don't like to get my hopes up. If somebody comes around with an interesting idea, I'll be happy to entertain it. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you again so much for coming, and thank you to Books and Books. To Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you. Folks, the books are for sale behind the counter. You buy a copy, and it will be signed right here by David himself. And I think you've got a reception coming up, so stick around. Have a great time. Thanks for being here.